Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
This is Book 6 of the Wolfman Chronicles. We're up to episode 64. This is chapter 1, Werewolves in Ireland. That's Achill Island in Ireland. The salty air of the Atlantic swept through Sasha's hair as she stood at the cliff's edge, overlooking Keem Bay. Below her, the rugged cliffs rose sharply, their jagged faces weathered by time and sea. The rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the jagged rocks below echoed upwards, a sound that was both soothing and invigorating, charged with restless energy. The air carried a damp chill tinged with the faint brine of kelp and seawater, and the whisper of something untamed. Jack stood a few feet away, his wolf-sharp senses keenly attuned to their surroundings. Though his posture was relaxed, almost peaceful as he gazed towards the crescent sweep of Keem Beach. The beach's golden sands glowed under the low sun, bordered by emerald hills that tumbled steeply into the crashing surf. The hills were dotted with sheep grazing the rich green grass. "This place," Sasha murmured, pulling her woolen sweater tight against her. "It feels ancient, Jack, like it holds secrets older than time itself." Jack nodded, his piercing gaze fixed on the meeting point of sea and sky where the setting sun spread molten gold across the horizon. "It is," he said, his voice low. "You can feel it, in the rocks and in the wind. There's something here, something raw and untamed, something primal." They had come to Achill Island for a break, a chance to breathe, to escape the snowbound tension of Alaska and lose themselves in the rugged beauty of Ireland's west coast. But this wasn't merely an escape. From the moment they stepped onto the island, the air had been heavy with an almost tangible sense of history. Achill Island, nestled in the ancient barony of Burry-Shule, County Mayo, and the largest of Ireland's isles, had a way of pulling at the edges of reality, blurring the line between the present and the long-forgotten past. Now, centuries ago, this island had been covered in thick forests, a haven for Neolithic settlers who worked the land and erected megalithic tombs, their silent monuments scattered across the hillside and along the coastline. Now the forests were gone, replaced by windswept grasses and moss-covered ruins, crumbled castles, forts, and the lingering bones of stone cottages. Keem Beach was small but welcoming. It had once been a fishing community, but the stone buildings had long since been abandoned, with the most notable structure being the ruins of Boycott's house. Charles Cunningham Boycott had been an unpopular landlord known for his harsh treatment of his tenants during the late 1800s. At the time, the large landowners would evict farmers that leased their land, even if they had paid their rents. The tenant farmers and the townsfolk fought back by ostracizing Mr. Boycott. After a time, the word boycotting took hold, has been used ever since. The ruins of his house were a short walk from Keem Beach. Sheep had grazed the lush green hillside, and Sasha stopped to take several pictures. "Why are they marked with different colors?" she asked. "Well, there's several reasons, the most common being that sheep like to wander, so farmers use paint to identify which sheep belongs to them. That's an easy way to know if the sheep is yours or your neighbor's, and then during breeding season, farmers will use a paint or a colored crayon of sorts attached to a belt around the ram's neck and chest so that when the ram mounts a ewe, the crayon will leave a mark on the ewe's back. Now that way, they know which ram is fathering the lamb. And then, after pregnancy screening, the ewe is marked with different colors or dots to indicate how many lambs they're carrying. You know, it just prevents arguing between neighbors, Jack replied. Well, they were staying in Dugort, a small windswept village clinging to the northern edge of Achill Island. Nestled at the base of Sleevermore Mountain, in true Irish fashion, every building in Dugort was painted stark white, their thick stone walls built to endure the relentless ocean winds. And at dusk, the cottage seemed to glow with a soft, spectral light, their chimneys exhaling thin trails of smoke that drifted lazily into the crisp Atlantic air. Their home for the week was the old fisherman's cottage, a snug, time-worn dwelling steeped in history. Its uneven wooden floors and weathered beams spoke of decades past, a place that had braved countless storms while offering shelter to generations of the same family. Recently, had been transformed into a lively pub for a movie production, but now it had returned to the quiet, peaceful sanctuary for travelers seeking solace amidst Ireland's rugged beauty. Jack had chosen the cottage for its charm and its proximity to the ocean. The yard stretched right to the edge of the cliffs overlooking the beach. They had rented it with the intention of a brief Irish escape before they returned to Alaska for a Christmas holiday. It was a fleeting reprieve, a chance to explore the Emerald Isles cliffs and coastlines before deciding if they'd venture back here or somewhere new in the coming year. Oh, for now, they had the luxury of time. With Miguel watching over the property back home and Rosa fussing over Grizzly like a doting mother hen, Jack and Sasha found themselves untethered. The freedom to travel and the quiet of the island brought a sense of calm, as though they had momentarily stepped out of their own story and into the timeless rhythm of Achill. The locals, they had been kind, their Irish lilts weaving a melody of welcome wherever Jack and Sasha went as they explored the restaurants and the bars. And in the evenings, they sought out the pubs that the locals enjoyed, with good Irish music and plenty of Guinness. It was during one such night, after a hearty meal of Irish stew and brown bread, that their peaceful retreat had taken an unexpected turn. Jack had just returned from the village pub with a bottle of Irish whiskey, the firelight glinting off his golden eyes as he set the bottle down on the small table in front of the fireplace. Sasha was curled up on the sofa, flipping through a local history book that she'd found in the cottage. "Jack, listen to this," she said, her voice curious and excited. "The legend of the Faoladh of Achill, it says here that they were the clan of shapeshifters, wolfmen, who once protected the people of this region. They were both feared and revered, and often called upon to guard against invaders or supernatural threats." Jack smirked, pouring them both a glass. "Sounds just a little too familiar." Sasha continued, her tone more serious now. "But as time passed, the wolves were hunted and forced to retreat into the shadows. It's said that their descendants still walk among us, waiting for the time when they'll rise again." Jack handed the glass to Sasha. "Well, what's the date on that book?" Sasha checked. "Well, it was published in the 1930s. Why?" He leaned against the mantel, his jaw tight. "Because I saw something earlier today when I was out near the cliffs. You were already down by the beach." Sasha's heart skipped a beat. "I remember you hung back to look at the rocks. What'd you see?" Jack hesitated, as if unsure how to describe it. "A figure, tall, cloaked in black, standing near the edge of the cliffs. And when I looked again, it was gone. No tracks, no scent. I just shrugged it off as the light playing tricks on my eyes." "Well, what makes you think it might have something to do with this book?" Sasha asked him. "I don't know," Jack responded. It's probably nothing, but I got a strange feeling when I saw him standing there. There was something about how he was dressed, as if he didn't belong to this time period. And when he looked at me, his eyes were a strange color of green, kind of almost glowing. And before Sasha could respond to this, the wind outside picked up, howling against the stone walls of the cottage, when a sudden knock at the door startled both of them. Now, who could that be at this hour? Sasha asked, rising to her feet. Jack moved towards the door, his instincts on edge. He opened it slowly, revealing a young woman with wild red hair and piercing green eyes. She was barefoot, her dress was tattered, and her expression was a mixture of desperation and determination. "You're him," she said, her voice trembling. Jack stiffened, his hand gripping the doorframe. "Who are you?" "There's no time," she replied, glancing over her shoulder at the darkness beyond. "They're coming. You have to help me." Sasha stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Who's coming?" The woman turned back to them, her voice barely a whisper. "The ones who want to kill you." And with that, the wind surged, slamming the door shut. Jack quickly opened the door again, but there was no one there. He glanced up and down the street, but there was no woman anywhere to be seen. He slowly closed the door again, locking it against the wind, and turned towards Sasha. "Did we really just see that, or have I had too much whiskey?" he asked Sasha incredulously. Sasha stood gaping at the door. After a hearty breakfast, the next morning they hiked to the deserted village on the southern slopes of Slevemore, where the remains of as many as 100 stone cottages sit in varying degrees of ruin. Up until the 1940s, the dwellings were used as summer booley houses for the families that would move their cattle to the high ground for grazing, a custom called bullying. Now the wind had died down, and though the air was brisk, the hike up to the deserted village had warmed them up. Jack and Sasha had brought a picnic lunch of corned beef sandwiches and a small blanket to sit on. Sasha had brought the book she had found in the cottage, and after eating their sandwiches, Jack lay back on the blanket, staring up at the clouds, while Sasha read to him from the book. Irish werewolves are said to be able to shape-shift into wolves at will, usually during the full moon. Now, unlike other werewolves from folklore, Irish werewolves were not considered evil, but were seen as protectors of their communities. It was believed that they would use their powers to defend their families and their loved ones from harm. According to some version of the legend, Irish werewolves were believed to be especially protective of children. They would go to great lengths to keep them safe from harm. One famous story involves a mother who was out walking with her young one when they were approached by a pack of wolves. The mother was terrified, but the wolves surrounded them and kept them safe until help arrived. When the villagers came to rescue the mother and the child, they found that the wolves had not harmed them and had even left a deer carcass for them to eat. In another story, an Irish werewolf is said to have saved a young girl from a group of bandits who had kidnapped her. The werewolf chased the bandits away and returned the girl safely to her family. These stories and others like them illustrate the idea that Irish werewolves were not simply savage beasts, but rather were protectors of their communities who would use their powers to defend the most vulnerable members of society. In some versions of the legend, Irish werewolves were said to be able to communicate with other animals and even control them. They were also believed to possess superhuman strength and speed, which they used to protect their communities from threats. Interestingly, evidence suggests that belief in Irish werewolves persisted well into the 18th and the 19th century. Some historical accounts indicate that people who exhibited erratic or violent behavior were accused of being werewolves and were sometimes subjected to harsh punishment. Wolves were once a common sight in Ireland, and Evidence suggests that they existed on the island as far back as 3,400 years ago. However, over time, the wolf population in Ireland began to decline due to the hunting, habitat loss, and human persecution. It is believed that wolves were utterly wiped out from Ireland in the late 1700s or early 1800s. The exact date of their extinction is difficult to determine, as there's conflicting accounts and a lack of reliable records. However, it is generally agreed upon that the wolves were extinct in Ireland by the mid-1800s. Today, efforts are underway to reintroduce wolves to Ireland, with some conservationists arguing that they could play an essential role in restoring the ecosystem's natural balance. However, there is also opposition to the idea, with some people expressing concerns about the potential impact of wolves on livestock and on other wildlife. Now, that's pretty much the same story all over the world. Wolves just don't have a place in today's world, Sasha continued. She glanced at Jack and saw that, he'd dozed off. She smiled, wondering if he'd heard any of what she'd read to him. She put their glass bottles and trash back into the knapsack and grabbed her sweater. She left Jack sleeping and left to explore the ruins. Jack woke with a start. He'd been dreaming of the woman with the wild red hair, and in his dream, she had once again come to their door. He had let her in, and the woman had staggered forward, her bare feet leaving damp footprints on the wooden floor. She clutched at the back of a chair for support, her green eyes flickering with fear and urgency. "They know that you're here," she had said, looking directly at Jack. "You're the one they've been waiting for, the one that prophecy speaks of." "What prophecy? Who's waiting for me?" he had asked the girl, but just then a scream had echoed through the fog of his dream, and Jack woke, momentarily lost and trying to make sense of his surroundings. He glanced around for Sasha, but she was no longer on the blanket beside him. He quickly jumped up and yelled, "Sasha, where are you?" He tried to recall what direction the scream had come from, but he wasn't entirely sure it hadn't been part of his dream. So he called out Sasha's name again. Jack's voice echoed off the crumbling stone walls of the deserted village, fading into the silence of the mountainside. The only response was the whistle of the wind through the ruins. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with unease. "Sasha," he called again, louder this time, his voice rough with desperation. He jogged past the weathered stone cottages, their windows and their doorways gaping like hollow eyes. A faint rustling came from somewhere ahead, followed by what sounded like the crunch of footsteps on the gravel pathway. "Sasha, is that you?" Jack called out, his breath clouding in the cold air. He followed the sound, rounding the corner of one of the larger ruins. And there she was, standing in front of what appeared to be an old stone fireplace, which had been converted into an altar. Jars of flowers and candles had been placed on the stone steps and the fallen mantelpiece. Sasha's back was to him, her head tilted slightly as though she was listening to something only she could hear. The wind played with her hair, and she seemed almost statuesque, as if she were in a trance. Relief had surged through Jack when he saw her standing there, but as he called out her name and she didn't respond, he grew anxious. "Sasha, are you okay?" he asked as he came up beside her. She turned slowly to face him, and his breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were wide, her face was pale, as if fear had frozen her features into something not quite human. He put his arm around her shoulder and drew her near. "Sasha, can you hear me?" he asked her. Slowly, awareness seemed to come back into her eyes, and she took a deep breath. "Jack, when did you get here?" she asked. He looked at her, not sure what to say. "Well, I called for you. I heard you scream. What happened?" "I don't know. I thought I fell. I had the strangest feeling that I was falling into a deep hole, but there's no hole here." She gazed around, looking at the broken ground around her feet, a mixture of grass and round cobblestone rocks, scattered with stones that had once been part of the walls and the foundation of this stone house that had once stood on this very spot. "Well, maybe you tripped over something," Jack replied. "Yeah, maybe I did. I know I reached for this scrap of paper I saw lying near the candles on the stone hearth." She held out a rough piece of parchment. The edges were charred. Strange, intricate symbols were scrawled across it in a dark ink, their meaning indecipherable. And in the center of the parchment was an unmistakable image, a wolf's head, its eyes glowing, a vivid green that seemed to shimmer. "What's this?" asked Jack, reaching for the parchment. But the moment his fingers touched it, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He recoiled, staring at his palm, which now bore a faint, glowing imprint of the wolf's head. The piece of parchment fluttered to the ground. "What the hell?" he muttered, flexing his hand as the glow and the pain faded. Before either of them could say another word, the wind picked up suddenly, howling through the ruins like a living thing. A low, guttural growl echoed through the remnants of the deserted village, and Jack instinctively stepped in front of Sasha, his eyes darting to the shadows. The growl came again, closer this time, and Jack's blood ran cold. It wasn't a dream, it was real, and whatever it was coming for them. "We need to go now," Jack said, grabbing Sasha's arm and pulling her toward the path. But as they turned to leave, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a nearby ruin. It was the man Jack had seen earlier, tall and cloaked in black. "Hey," Jack called, but the man turned with a slight swirl of his cape and quickly walked away in the opposite direction. Jack began to run after him, but the man darted behind an old stone building and just disappeared. Jack's breath quickened as he scanned the shadows around the building where the man was last seen. The air felt electric, and it made his skin prickle with an unseen energy. Sasha tugged at his arm. "Jack, we have to leave. Something doesn't feel right," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Jack replied. He looked down at the glowing imprint on his hand, its faint luminescence still pulsing like a heartbeat. Another deep growl echoed through the ruins, this one deeper, angrier, and impossibly close. Jack turned, positioning Sasha behind him, his body taut with instinctive readiness to fight whatever was closing in on them. The shadows at the edge of the cluster of abandoned stone buildings seemed to ripple, the landscape beyond shifting, just slightly, as if it retreating further into the distance. Sasha clutched his arm. "Jack, look!" she whispered, pointing towards a piece of parchment. The wind had picked it up, and the paper seemed to dance and whirl across the stones, suspended in midair, then dropping at Jack's feet. The symbol on it burned with a fiery green light. Jack reached down to pick up that scrap of parchment and again felt the burning sensation in the palm of his hand. The growling was now a deafening roar, combining with the wind and coming from all directions. Jack's sharp eyes caught a movement at the far edge of the village ruins, and suddenly, from behind the stone wall, a massive wolf-like creature stepped forward. Its fur black as midnight, and the eyes glowing the same vivid green as the symbols on the parchment. It was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Larger than a bear, its muscles rippling with an unnatural strength. Its gaze locked onto Jack, and it let out a guttural snarl that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. As the creature took a step forward, Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and he felt his body shift. There was no time to take off his clothes. He'd have to rip through his clothing to transform into his wolf form. But before Jack could react, the creature leapt forward. It landed mere feet from him, its breath hot and reeking of earth and blood. Sasha screamed, but the wolf didn't attack. Instead, it sank to its haunches and lowered its massive body down in a posture of supplication. Its gaze shifted to Jack's glowing hand, and it let out a low rumble, almost like a growl of recognition. Jack froze, his mind racing. The imprint on his hand flared brighter, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to fade. He felt a rush of images, ancient forests, moonlit nights, battles fought under the stars. The glow from Jack's hand intensified, and the wolf rose, its eyes never leaving Jack's. The wolf let out a howl that echoed through the stone building and across the mountainside. Then it turned and it ran, disappearing in the direction that the mysterious man had gone. Sasha had stood behind Jack through that encounter with the wolf, gripping his arm the whole while. Now she stepped forward, visibly shaken. Jack put his arm around her and walked her in the opposite direction that the wolf had gone. Dark clouds were beginning to gather, and it looked as if it might begin to rain. "Let's get to the nearest pub. I could sure use a drink," Jack said. "And I'd like to know if any of the locals have any idea of what we just witnessed." They gathered their knapsack and the blanket of which the wind had blown against one of the buildings. They headed down the trail for town. The scent of warm chowder and freshly baked brown bread filled the cozy interior of Gilty's pub. Its low ceilings and wooden beams created a snug retreat from the wild weather that was outside. Jack and Sasha sat at the corner table near the hearth, where the flames from a peat fire crackled, sending shadows flickering across the stone walls. Around them, locals chattered in lilting tones, their voices weaving into the soft strains of a fiddle tune playing from the speakers behind the bar. The bar had an atmosphere where time seemed to slow, the air thick with stories as old as the hills that surrounded them. There was something about this little island with its small population of only about 2,500 souls, its cliffs, peat bogs, sandy beaches, and the overwhelming raging Atlantic Ocean that drew people back over and over again. It was the kind of place where you could strike up a conversation with a stranger, and it's as if you've known him forever. Their bowls of steaming hot wild Atlantic seafood chowder sat half finished in front of them when an older man approached their table. His ruddy cheeks and his weathered hands marked him as someone who'd spent much of his life braving the elements. He wore a dark tweed cap, tilted slightly to one side, and his piercing blue eyes sparked with curiosity. "Ye look like you knew here," the man said with a grin, his accent thick. "Tourists, I take it?" Jack smiled and nodded at him, gesturing to an empty seat. "Guilty as charged. Will you join us?" The man chuckled, tipping his hat in thanks as he settled into the chair. "I'm Seamus. Been living on Achill all me life. What's brought ye to our wee rock, then?" Sasha leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "It's so beautiful here. We were drawn to the history, the legends, the wildness of it all. We've been hearing bits and pieces about this Faoladh, the Wolfman warriors. Do you know anything about them?" At the mention of the Faoladh, Seamus's expression shifted. His jovial demeanor gave way to something more serious, a quiet reverence. He took a sip from the pint of stout he had brought over and leaned closer, lowering his voice as if to not be overheard. "Ah, the Faoladh," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Not just any old tale, mind ye. They were said to be the guardians, protectors of the people, in times of war or famine, as they'd leave their human forms behind and take on the guise of wolves, fierce, powerful creatures that roam the forests and the bogs. But unlike the wolves of other legends, the Faoladhs weren't monsters. They were heroes." Jack exchanged a glance with Sasha, his interest piqued. "So they aren't cursed like other werewolves?" "No, not cursed, no," Seamus replied, shaking his head. "Blessed, some would say, though it wasn't an easy life. The Faolahs carried the weight of the community on their shoulders. They'd fight to protect the villages from invaders, fend off wild beasts, even guide lost travelers home, but the transformation came at a price. Many of them couldn't return fully to their human selves. The wolf would linger within, a restless spirit. Sasha's gaze was intense, her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug. Did people fear them? Seamus smiled wryly. Aye, there was fear, but it was a respectful kind. The Faoladh were something otherworldly, and that made folks uneasy, but they were also necessary. When the wolves of the wild vanished from Ireland, it was said that the Faoladh went with them, as if their purpose was tied to the land itself. Jack leaned back, swirling the last of his beer in his glass. Do you think they were real or just a story? Seamus paused, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to meet Jack's. What is real, lad? Legends don't spring from nothin'. There are truths in them, even if they're hidden behind poetry and time. Some say that the Faoladh are still with us, not in wolves, but in the people. Those who'd risk everything to protect their kin, their home. Maybe you've already met a few without even knowing it. The fire crackled, and for a moment the three of them sat in contemplative silence. Outside, the wind howled around the corner of the pub, as if carrying the echoes of those ancient protectors through the hills and into the present. As the evening deepened and the shadows grew long, Jack and Sasha watched the fire flickering softly beside them, and listened to old fishing tales combined with an occasional fiddle tune. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Well, there's more to this place than we thought, Sasha said, her voice barely audible over the wind that howled outside. More than just legends and stories. Jack nodded. His eyes were scanning the darkening room. He'd felt it too, the creeping sense that they were being drawn into something far larger than they had imagined. Suddenly, the door to the pub blew open with a gust of cold air and shattered the quiet hum of the pub. Glasses rattled on the table, and the low murmur of voices fell silent as everyone turned towards the source of the sound, the front door, which now hung open, swinging wildly in the wind. A shadowed figure stepped inside, draped in a long black cloak, drenched from the rain. The tall man's eyes flickered towards Jack and Sasha, his face half hidden beneath the hood. Jack saw his eyes blaze with an otherworldly green, and in that instant, something in his gaze sent a shiver down his spine. The man walked over to the bar and whispered something to the bartender, then turned and walked back out into the stormy night. Who was that man? Jack inquired, but Seamus merely shrugged his shoulders. You don't want to mess with him, Seamus replied. He stood up and put on his jacket. I best be getting home to the missus, or she'll tend me hide. The road back to Dugort was dark, and it was wet, the rain hammering relentlessly against the windshield as the car's wipers struggled to keep up. The narrow road twisted and turned along the cliffs, the headlights barely cutting through the thickening fog. The sound of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below rose and fell like a ghostly chorus, adding to the unease that had settled over them since leaving the pub. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set in quiet focus, while Sasha stared out the window, her thoughts a storm of questions and half-formed fears. Every now and then, the flash of distant lightning illuminated the rugged landscape, casting fleeting shadows that seemed almost alive. As they rounded a sharp curve, a sudden flash of movement streaked across the road, a dark blur cutting through the rain. Jack slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick pavement. Sasha's hand shot out, bracing against the dashboard as the car lurched to a stop. What was that? Sasha gasped, her voice trembling as she scanned the fog-shrouded road ahead. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He peered into the darkness, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of what had just crossed their path. It looked like, he hesitated, his voice low and uncertain, a small wolf. But that couldn't be. Wolves hadn't roamed Ireland in centuries. The two sat in tense silence, the rain drumming on the roof of the car. Then, from somewhere beyond the cliffs, came a long, mournful howl that cut through the storm like a blade. It was a sound that didn't belong to the wild waves or to the wind. It was something older, something primal. As the car rolled forward again, the howl echoed once more, following them like a ghost through the storm. Well, join us next week on the Wolfman Chronicles as Jack and Sasha's search for answers pulls them deeper into the heart of Achill Island's mysteries and into the very darkness that they've been trying to outrun.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. Until then, have a great week, everyone.